start by saying this slowly, calmly, like a woman who has read the comments section and survived. This episode is not about faith bashing, culture bashing, or outrage click farming. It's about a pattern. And patterns are harder to cancel than people. History is full of powerful men, kings, prophets, emperors, lawmakers, rock legends, tech founders with space hobbies. And occasionally, when you zoom in, not always, but often enough to notice, you find something uncomfortable. A man at the height of status, aligning himself with someone at the very beginning of life. And suddenly, the internet explodes. Was it normal then? Was it common? Was it cultural? Was it misreported? Was it misunderstood? All interesting questions. But here's mine. Why is this pattern so persistent across civilizations that had nothing else in common except patriarchy and livestock? Because this isn't about one religious figure, one century, or one desert. This shows up in Rome, in medieval Europe, in aristocratic marriage contracts, in colonial settlements, in celebrity scandals. It shows up wherever power concentrates and youth becomes currency. And from a female perspective, yes, I brought my degree and my eyeliner. I can't help noticing something. The older the institution, the more it historically normalized men, pairing downward in age, not sideways, not upward, downward, and that's fascinating. Because attraction is one thing, but systematized attraction, endorsed, ritualized, defended, that's something else. That's structure. That's power logic. When societies defined adulthood by puberty rather than psychological maturity, the math looked different. Girls were transitioned quickly from child to wife because survival, lineage, alliances, and property mattered more than emotional development. Childhood, as we understand it today, is actually a fairly recent invention. For most of history, once you could bear children, you were categorized as woman. Full stop. But here's the modern twist. We now understand brain development. We understand consent. We understand autonomy. We understand trauma. And once you know those things, you can't unknow them. So when certain men today romanticize youth, not peers, not equals, but youth, it's worth asking what exactly is being romanticized. Is it beauty? Or is it asymmetry? Is it vitality? Or is it control? Because children don't negotiate power. Children don't outmaneuver seasoned authority. Children don't challenge narratives with life experience. Children are, by definition, in development. And that's where satire earns its paycheck. Because if you strip away theology, tribal custom, royal politics, and the phrase "it was a different time," you're left with a timeless question. Why do some men feel safest when they are unquestionably dominant? This isn't about condemning the past with present-day arrogance. It's about recognizing that history reflects human impulses, and some of those impulses are not noble. Some are about insecurity. Some are about ownership. Some are about constructing masculinity in a way that depends on imbalance. Healthy adult relationships require equality. They require two fully formed minds. They require consent that is informed, not inherited. And the uncomfortable truth is this: when attraction targets those who are not yet fully autonomous, it stops being romance and starts being a red flag with better PR. So tonight, we're not here to rage. We're here to examine. We're here to laugh carefully at the fragile architecture of male ego across time. We're here to ask why power so often leaned downward instead of standing beside. Because if masculinity is strong, it doesn't need someone smaller to feel tall. And that, my friends, is where the real joke begins. If we're going to be intellectually honest, and on this show we at least pretend to be, we have to separate three things: biology, culture, and pathology. Because when this topic comes up, someone inevitably whispers, but evolutionary psychology. Ah, yes, evolution, the universal excuse generator. Now, attraction to youthfulness in adults. That's not controversial. Signals of health, fertility, vitality, those are biological markers across species. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about children, pre-adults, humans who are cognitively, emotionally, neurologically unfinished. Biology does not require attraction to children. In fact, from a strictly evolutionary perspective, investing in offspring protection is the more stable strategy. So when someone tries to blur that line, youthfulness versus childhood, they're not doing science. They're doing rationalization. And rationalization is one of the most creative art forms ever invented by insecure power. Because here's the quiet truth: when attraction bypasses peers and lands on the undeveloped, it's rarely about reproduction. It's about hierarchy. It's about control without resistance. It's about shaping someone before they can shape you. That's not evolution. That's ego. And ego has been writing marriage contracts for centuries. Let's zoom out. For most of history, women were not social equals. They were legal minors under fathers, then husbands. Education, limited. Property, rights, rare. Autonomy, negotiable. In many societies, the younger the bride, the longer the husband controlled her trajectory. So when powerful men married very young girls in the ancient world, it wasn't just romance. It was strategy. Younger brides meant longer reproductive windows, yes, but also longer influence windows, less prior attachment, less independent identity, less negotiation. It's not that every historical marriage was predatory. Context matters. Mortality rates were different. Lifespans were different. Norms were different. But we can still observe a pattern. Power prefers pliability. What is childhood, if not pliability, embodied? This is where modern discomfort kicks in. Because once women gained education, income, and legal rights, something fascinating happened. The average marriage age rose. Suddenly, Men weren't marrying 12-year-olds. They were marrying 25-year-olds with opinions. And some men adapted beautifully. Others started romanticizing traditional values in suspiciously age-specific ways. Let's talk psychology. Gently but clearly. Healthy adult attraction is mutual. It involves shared development levels. It thrives on reciprocity. It requires the other person to be capable of consent in the full neurological sense, understanding consequences, boundaries, selfhood. When attraction targets children, it signals something fundamentally different. Not masculinity, not virility, not ancient instinct. It signals arrested development. There is a reason modern psychology classifies persistent attraction to children as a disorder, not as edgy, not as controversial, as a red flag requiring intervention, because children cannot participate in adult relational dynamics. They cannot meaningfully consent. Their brains are still wiring, and satire helps here because satire exposes absurdity. What does it say about a grown man if his ideal partner has to be someone who hasn't finished middle school? That dominance, or is that fear of equality? Strong men are not threatened by strong women. Only fragile ones need someone smaller to feel taller. Part 5. Here's the twist that makes this episode uncomfortable in a productive way. When we discuss historical figures, the debate often gets trapped in, did it happen? Or was it normal then? Important questions. But the deeper question is this: what do we defend when we defend it? Are we defending historical context? Fine. History is complex. Are we defending faith from mockery? Also understandable. Religious identity matters deeply to billions. But if we ever find ourselves defending the desirability of children as partners, that's when we've stepped off the intellectual path. Because no tradition, no empire, no ideology benefits from protecting harm. The modern world draws a hard line for a reason. Childhood is protected because development matters. Consent matters. Power imbalance matters. And here's the female perspective that tends to get overlooked. When women gained full adulthood, education, careers, property, voices, the marketplace of relationships shifted. Suddenly, men had to compete with equals, and some of them rose to the challenge. Others looked nostalgically at eras when women couldn't leave. That nostalgia tells us more about insecurity than about tradition. So tonight, we started with a trending headline, a historical debate, a name that sparks emotion on every side. But we didn't stay there. Because this isn't about one prophet, one century, or one civilization. It's about a recurring human pattern. Power gravitating toward vulnerability and calling it romance. We asked uncomfortable questions. Not to inflame, but to illuminate. Not to mock faith, but to dissect dynamics. Not to rewrite history, but to understand why certain behaviors persisted across it. And here's where I land as your resident jokester with a microphone and a moral compass. Healthy masculinity does not require imbalance, does not require silence. It does not require youth as insulation against accountability. Healthy masculinity can stand beside a fully formed woman and not shrink. That's not satire. That's the punchline. History is still learning. Let's slow this down and take it out of the comment section for a minute. Whenever this topic explodes online, someone inevitably says, well, back then it was normal, and they're not entirely wrong. In many pre-modern societies, marriage ages were lower than today. Life expectancy was shorter. Puberty marked adulthood. Alliances mattered more than emotional compatibility. Childhood, as a protected psychological stage, wasn't conceptualized the way it is now. But normal is not the same as neutral. Slavery was normal in many civilizations. Absolute monarchy was normal. Women being legally owned was normal. History is full of norms that reveal more about power structures than about virtue. So when we examine early marriage historically, we have to ask, who benefited from that norm? Not the girls. Let's be honest. Marriage at very young ages overwhelmingly advantaged male guardians, tribal alliances, dynastic politics, property consolidation, and patriarchal continuity. The younger the bride, the more malleable the alliance, the less prior identity she carried into the union, the longer the window of control. That doesn't mean every historical marriage was abusive. Context matters, but patterns matter too. Because once societies industrialized, once women gained education, once legal adulthood expanded, something fascinating happened. The average marriage age rose dramatically, not because biology changed overnight, but because autonomy entered the equation. And autonomy changes everything. When a woman is educated, financially capable, socially mobile, and legally protected, the dynamic shifts from acquisition to negotiation, from guardianship to partnership. So when certain men romanticize eras of extremely young brides, what exactly are they romanticizing? Cultural continuity? Or asymmetry? Satire allows us to poke at that gently, like tapping the glass of a museum exhibit. If attraction were purely about biology, it would stabilize around healthy adult peers. It would seek reciprocity. It would thrive on intellectual parity. But when attraction consistently targets those with less power, less development, less capacity to resist, we are no longer in the realm of instinct. We're in the realm of hierarchy. And hierarchy has always loved youth. Youth is impressionable. Youth is teachable. Youth hasn't yet learned how to say, actually, I disagree. From a female perspective, that's the part that rings loudest. Because the moment women started disagreeing, publicly, confidently, legally, the cultural nostalgia for simpler times started to sound suspiciously selective. So if we're being intellectually honest on the Jokester Podcast, the real question isn't just whether something happened in the 7th century. The question is why certain power structures across history repeatedly leaned toward the youngest acceptable edge of womanhood, and sometimes beyond it, and whether that leaning says more about desire or about dominance. Now let's step into the psychological room, softly, carefully, because this is where the laughter gets quiet and the thinking gets loud. When adults form healthy relationships, there is friction, not bad friction, real friction. Two developed minds, two histories, two egos negotiating space. Equality is thrilling, but it's also demanding. You can't bluff intelligence. You can't fake emotional maturity for long. You can't permanently dominate someone who knows her worth. That requires strength. So here's the uncomfortable mirror. What kind of masculinity thrives only in asymmetry? Because if you look across history, and I mean across empires, religions, monarchies, democracies, celebrity cultures, you see a recurring theme. The more absolute the male authority, the younger the female counterpart tended to be. It wasn't framed as insecurity, was framed as tradition, or lineage, or purity, or alliance, or divine timing. Language is very good at perfume, but underneath the perfume, power likes predictability. And children are predictable. They're still forming, still learning, still absorbing, still defining reality through adult voices. That's not romance. That's imprinting. And this is where modern psychology becomes blunt. Persistent attraction to children is not categorized as bold masculinity. It's categorized as a disorder. Not because society suddenly became prudish, but because we now understand developmental science. We understand consent. We understand that neurological maturity continues well into the 20s. Children cannot meaningfully consent to adult relationships because they cannot fully grasp long-term consequences. Their identity is under construction. So, when attraction points there, the issue isn't cultural diversity. It's developmental imbalance. Now, I want to be precise here. Studying historical practices is not the same as endorsing them. Acknowledging that early marriages existed in ancient societies is not the same as approving them in the modern world. But when people today try to romanticize or defend the desirability of children, that's where satire sharpens its teeth. Because strong men are not intimidated by adult women with degrees, income, and opinions. Strong men do not need a partner who hasn't finished cognitive development to feel secure. If your confidence depends on someone being smaller, younger, less experienced, and structurally dependent, that's not dominance. That's fragility wearing a crown. And maybe that's why this topic trends so explosively. Because it forces us to confront a recurring pattern. Some systems weren't built around partnership. They were built around control. And when control starts to crumble, when women become equal participants instead of assets, certain narratives begin to feel threatened. So the laughter in this episode isn't cruel. diagnostic. We're not mocking faith. We're not rewriting history. We're examining the psychological architecture that keeps resurfacing whenever power feels insecure. Because if masculinity is sturdy, it can handle equality. If it isn't, it starts looking for someone who can't argue back. Let's widen the lens even more, because this isn't just about individual psychology. It's about systems. Systems that were built long before modern ideas of consent, agency, and equality were even imagined. In many pre-modern societies, girls transitioned almost immediately from childhood to womanhood. There was no prolonged adolescence, no psychological buffer, no cultural concept of teenage years as a protected developmental stage. Puberty signaled readiness. Biologically, socially, legally. But here's the catch. Biology doesn't equal readiness for power dynamics. A body maturing does not mean a mind has. And yet, for centuries, societies collapsed those two categories into one. That collapse overwhelmingly benefited men. Because if adulthood is defined narrowly by physical capability, then authority remains comfortably in the hands of the older, established male. So when we examine history, we're not just looking at individual choices, we're looking at structural convenience. And structural convenience is rarely neutral. It's fascinating that as literacy expanded, as women gained property rights, as education became accessible, as legal adulthood became standardized, marriage ages climbed. Not everywhere at once. Not perfectly, but steadily. The more society recognized women as autonomous individuals, the less acceptable child marriage became. That's not coincidence. That's correlation with empowerment. And from a female comedic lens, because I do love a good irony, it's remarkable how often tradition gets invoked when equality feels inconvenient. When women are silent, it's stability. When women speak, it's rebellion. When women are young and compliant, it's purity. When women are experienced and assertive, it's too much. Too much what? Too much autonomy. Because here's the quiet evolution no one talks about enough. Modern masculinity doesn't have to prove itself through ownership anymore. It can prove itself through partnership, through collaboration, through emotional intelligence, through attraction that seeks equals rather than subordinates. That shift is uncomfortable for some. Equality demands competence. It demands self-awareness. It demands accountability. And accountability is a heavier crown than dominance ever was. So when this topic trends, whether tied to ancient figures, historical narratives, or contemporary scandals, the deeper conversation isn't about scoring points against a religion or a culture. It's about asking what kind of masculinity we are willing to normalize going forward. One rooted in imbalance, or one capable of standing beside a fully formed woman and not feeling diminished, because the future doesn't need men who feel powerful only when someone else is small. It needs men who can handle someone just as big. So here we are. We started with a headline that lights up the internet every time it's mentioned. A historical debate. A name that triggers emotion, loyalty, anger, defensiveness, outrage. And instead of staying in the shallow end, arguing dates, chains of narration, culture wars, we dove into something deeper. Power. Because this episode was never about one man or one century. It was about a recurring human pattern. When power is unchecked, it often drifts toward vulnerability and calls it tradition. We talked about history, without pretending history was spotless. We talked about psychology, without pretending biology is destiny. We talked about masculinity, without pretending it's fragile by default. And here's the part I want to leave you with. Healthy masculinity is not threatened by equality. Healthy masculinity doesn't need someone younger, smaller, less formed, less experienced in order to feel tall. Healthy masculinity can handle a woman with a voice, a resume, boundaries, and opinions. If your strength collapses when the woman across from you is fully developed, that's not ancient instinct. That's insecurity in a historical costume. And satire exists for exactly this reason. Not to insult faith, not to mock cultures, not to provoke for sport, but to expose contradictions, to hold a mirror up gently, humorously, intelligently. Because when something keeps repeating across centuries, the most radical thing we can do is ask why. So if this episode made you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is where thinking starts. If it made you defensive, ask yourself what you're defending. If it made you laugh, thank you. Laughter is how we survive hard conversations. This has been The Jokester, your friendly neighborhood female comic with a microphone and too many questions. Stay curious, stay critical, and never confuse power with entitlement. I'll see you next week.